Okay. Good evening, everyone. Whoever is here, you can let me know. I think I'm in the right place this time. I think I'm just in the church. So if you're on, if you want to let me know that you are here, that would be great. So I don't know if I have anyone on yet. So today we are going to start doing more in depth into Romans, the first few chapters of Romans. Oh, I see somebody up there. So let me know if you're here. Um, but we're going to start a more in-depth look at the first couple of chapters of Romans. I doubt we're going to make it very far to Romans chapter 3. I may have been a little ambitious. I usually am in thinking about how far, because by the time we get to Romans chapter 3 and 4, we get embroiled in a really significant theological conversation. And so I think I may save those for next week so that we can spend the appropriate time on them, because I suspect you're going to have questions. So one of the things I think is, if you do have questions, you can send those to me. If you want to send them to me in advance, if there's things in particular that you want to know about. I'm sure some of you have already, as you have started reading through Romans, you have started realizing how familiar some of the verses are, that maybe you memorized them. Oh, and that's okay, Tommy. We just started. So if you remember, some of them are familiar if you memorized the Romans Road as a child, like I did. And I'm trying to type and talk at the same time, so that's never very good to do. But what I was saying was, just if you have any questions for Romans chapters 3 and 4 for next time, send them my way, because we get into some pretty deep theological waters. And so I want to make sure that we get those right. So today we're mostly going to be in chapter 1 and 2, but we're going to push into 3. And then next week we'll finish up with these first 4 chapters and move into chapters 5 through 8. So let me just start with a little bit of an overview again. And remember, Romans is a letter written in the mid-50s by Paul to the early churches, the house churches in Rome. And we know that there were several house churches in Rome. And in fact, if we read the greetings in Romans 16, it seems to suggest that some of those names that are listed in Romans 16 are actually members of those house churches, which makes a lot of sense. And so there is, potentially upwards of 5 or more house churches for sure that we can see. We know for sure that we see one set of house churches, because it says the church that is in their house. So we can flip to Romans 16 just one more time. It never hurts to remind ourselves. In verse 3, it says, "Greet Prisca and Aquila, who work with me in Christ Jesus, who risk their necks. Greet also the church in their houses." And so Scott McKnight suggests that as we move through Romans 16, that we're actually seeing Paul addressing these actual house churches. And again, this makes a lot of sense. This is what Paul does in his other letters. We see this. We know that Paul is on familiar terms with many of these in the early church. Some of them are the churches that he has helped convert himself. And so they are from his missionary travels. He and Barnabas, they actually went, and they may have converted some of these people through their own preaching and through their own words. And so they would be familiar. We know that some of these that Paul was preaching to, that they then went into some of these other places and started house churches themselves. And so even if Paul doesn't know everybody intimately that's in those house churches, he knows some of the people that are in them. So he's connected to all these places. We also know that many of the members of the early church would tell Paul about problems that they were experiencing. And this, again, is something that comes up pretty much in his letters. We hear him where he says, "I heard," or "so-and-so was there and they told me." And so we know he's getting reports. And so all of this leads us, everything else that Paul has done in all of his other letters is write a letter addressing a specific problem to a group of people in these early churches. So why would we think he's not doing the same thing with Romans? Let me just pause there for a minute. I mean, this actually is something that I only recently started thinking about. And when I did, I was like, oh my, I mean, this is just really, really amazing. I mean, we treat Romans like it's this big systematic theology that's set apart like everything else. And Paul is writing this big grand treatise in which he is like, okay, now I'm going to tell all Christians, all believers for all time, how they should read the Bible, how they should understand salvation, how they should understand the nature of Christ. And so we're going to do this all in this one big sweep. Paul doesn't ever do that. He hasn't done that in any of his other letters. Paul's theology, Paul's understanding of the early church, we can certainly find. In fact, Paul always says the same things. He is highly consistent. So we can glean parts of Romans from all of his other letters. And so the idea is that Paul is doing in Romans exactly what he's always been doing. He is writing to an early set of Christians who are experiencing problems, and he's helping them. He's reminding them of what the gospel is, and the gospel, and all of his letters, he always goes back to the gospel of Christ. So he reminds them, and then he jumps right in addressing their problems. Okay, so this makes a lot of sense. Let me pause and see if there's any questions or comments. I don't know, Tommy, if you have any thoughts about that. I know there's a little bit of a lag. So I will see. I'll keep my eye on the comments over here if anybody wants to do anything. And so now that we've painted that framework. Oh, one more thing that we need to do to remind us is we are actually getting into the theology, the big theology that we find Paul talking about. And that is, we have to remember who these early believers are in Rome. Okay, it's not that he is talking to just these specific house churches, but these specific house churches in Rome. First of all, they are in Rome. Okay, they are in Rome. This is the most important place. Tommy asks why Paul wrote so much to this church that he did not necessarily know compared to the other letters. Yeah, that's a really good question, Tommy. So one of the reasons that I thought about doing Romans is because it's so directly connected to Galatians. And in fact, a lot of what we saw and we learned from Galatians actually Paul seems to be fleshing out a little bit more maturely, I suppose. This is possible, not 10 years later, but it's several years after he wrote Galatians and Romans. I think part of it is because the house churches in Rome this is a big area. There are a lot of early Christians here. Rome is also a very Gentile world. It's a very pagan world. And so and it's also in the heart, even though there were Jews there, the Jews got kicked out. And even though some of them did come back, remember all of that happened in the late 40s, even though we know some of these early Christians did come back, you can imagine that they are starting with less than maybe some of the other places where Paul founded churches. And so part of it on the one hand, this is a really critical place in the Roman world for there to be strong house churches that can reach out to others and keep Christianity strong. This is Rome. But at the same time, there are more challenges in some ways, perhaps to Rome. So I think part of it maybe is just that Paul realizes the significance of the place and the significance of the believers who are there. There seems to be a hotspot of all of these, important people. If we go through Romans 16 again, he talks about all of these early leaders in the Roman church, these significant early believers. And, he says, Prisca and Aquila, who risked their lives for my neck, and so maybe they were with him when he was being persecuted or whatever, but clearly they were very important to helping Paul himself. He says, greet my beloved Epaenetus, who was the first convert in Asia for Christ. So the first person who heard the gospel from Paul in Asia Minor and converted. And so he obviously is a significant person. Mary, who has worked hard among you. Andronicus and Junia, who were in prison with me. They are prominent among the apostles. So we have in here, people who are listed as apostles who also saw. Hi, Belinda. How are you? Who also were, and if way back when we talked about who apostle was, back in James. Apostles are, and also in Galatians, but apostles are people who saw Jesus, who received the word of God directly from Jesus. And so here we have these prominent apostles who are listed here. So I think maybe part of it is that this is such an important, I mean, not that all the early churches aren't important, they are, but there is a high concentration. There's somewhere around 200, 250 Christians in Rome during this time, probably all concentrated within these house churches. It's highly visible, and it's an important part of the early church. So I think that's maybe part of it, is why there's a lot of them there. So I think that could be part of it. And Paul is also, and they seem to have, and I think this may be it too, because the Jews who were there and were kicked out, and of course it's not like Jerusalem. It's not a place where the Jews have always been welcome, where they have historic roots. It's not in a part of the world where the Jewish people historically were from. It's in a very pagan part of the world, and this Roman world. And so I think Paul finds it's very critical that they get it right. And as they send out people from their churches, that they make sure that they get it right. Okay, so is that helpful, Tommy? I think that may be part of it. Is just that this is really crucial and critical. I think also that the problem that Paul sees in Romans, in these Roman churches, is also a problem that he's seen in other churches. Okay, and one of the things he knows about his letters, and we know this, is that they don't just stay within the churches they're written to, they're also passed around. Okay, so we know this. So even though Paul is writing to Romans, he also knows, writing to the churches in Rome, he knows that they're also going to be passed around. So he's dealing with a specific problem here, but he also knows that this problem could repeat in other places. And in fact, we know it has repeated in other places, because we see him talking about the same problem in Galatians. So I think all of those things rolled together, if that maybe helps a little bit. So what is the problem? What is Paul so concerned about? And I've written down here that, look, so if we take this premise that Paul is writing a pastoral letter written specifically to these house churches in Rome, he's writing to a specific group of believers who are encountering specific problems. And the problem that they are encountering, that Paul really wants to make sure they get right, is a lack of unity. And this lack of unity is caused by divisions between the Jewish believers in Rome and the Gentile believers in Rome. Okay? And Scott McKnight calls these the Jewish believers in Rome. He labels them the weak. This comes from chapter 14. And the Gentile believers in Rome, he labels the strong. Now that might be the converse of what we would think. We would think the Jews would be the strong and the Gentiles would be the weak. Do you remember why? What is that? What is Paul, by labeling or by considering the Jewish believers the weak, what are we learning about the place of these Jewish Christians? Any thoughts? I know I may not be able to get, time responses in time, but I want you to think before I tell you. This is, the Jewish people for a long time had been those set apart by God. They were the strong. They were the ones who had been given the law, the Torah. They had God. I mean, think about Jeb's sermon this morning where, they had the Ark of the Covenant. They had God in a box, although that wasn't a great way of looking at it. But that's, God was with them. Emmanuel, God with us. I mean, God was with them. And then came Jesus, God in flesh, God with us again. And Jesus was a Jew. He came to set them all free. All of this, but the twist is that Jesus wasn't just for the Jews. And this really radically changes things for the Jewish people. And I can imagine how hard this was for them. On the one hand, I mean, that's actually in chapter 3, they're like, why aren't we special? Is there anything special about being a Jew? I mean, that's essentially the question they're asking. Like, what the heck is this for? Does it mean anything more that we are Jewish? Paul says, yes, you got it first, but no, it doesn't mean, now moving forward, it doesn't mean as much as it once did. So I think so now they have been put in a weakened position. Not to mention that the Gentiles, these Roman believers, whereas the Jewish believers are from poorer families, they don't have as much money, they don't have as much social clout, they don't have as much political clout. They are the weaker members of the Roman society. They're at the mercy of the Roman Empire, whereas these Gentile believers are not. They come from families that are well off, that are part of the social and political world of Rome, like Paul himself, and they are stronger. And so the division really is the Jewish people. The division comes on both sides, whereas the Gentiles are just like they're like, y'all just get over it. This is the way we've got to move into this. We don't know what all your hangups are about. Not to mention the fact that they keep pulling in things from their old pagan world, and we see Paul addressing some of those. But then with the Jewish people, what they're trying to do is they're like, hey, yes, Jesus came, but Jesus was a Jew. And in order to believe, you got to be Jewish. They wanted the Gentiles to follow the law. This is a battle that Paul has fought before and is now fighting again. And so Paul seems to be making, it's like in Romans, he's like, okay, let's stop this. Let's lay this out really clearly, because we have a really big group of people where this is a problem. So let's lay it out really clearly. And so what he does is he immediately, and the reason that we know, as I said, if you go to Romans chapter 1, if there's any other questions, put those up for me. In Romans chapter 1, first of all, as I said, Paul always tells us, first of all, what, the purpose of what he's doing, everything. And in 1:16, he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, first to the Jew and also to the Greek, the Gentile. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. So on the one hand, this is a blanket. He's like, this is what it's for. It's about salvation. I am not ashamed of the gospel. The power of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, who saves everyone. And yes, it came first to the Jews, but it is not for the Jews only. And by the end of that chapter 17, where it says the one who is righteous will live by faith, he is definitely harking back to Abraham. And in fact, he's going to pick this theme back up again. And remember, Abraham, faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. Okay? So it wasn't the law that saved Abraham. It was his faith. And so Paul already is reminding him, he was like, hey, yeah, it was given to the Jews first, but remember, it was given to Abraham, who was nothing special at that time. And the reason that he was saved is because he believed. Okay? So Paul already spins it towards that Jewish audience. Okay? Gentiles would not have picked up on this as much. These Gentile believers in the house church, somebody would have to tell them. This is, we've all can think of times in our lives where we have joined groups or joined something, or even like when you come to a new church and everybody knows things because they've been there for a long time and you don't know. The Gentiles don't know all this stuff yet. And so it seems really clear here that Paul is speaking to these Jewish believers. Okay? And then we know that for sure when we hit verses 18 through the end of chapter 1, 18 through 32. And these verses have tripped people up for a long time. On the one hand, I mean, if you read through it, it says, and this is also one of the reasons that Romans has been read universally. Okay, like this is, Paul is writing huge theology that is, this is applicable to everybody. On the one hand, the Bible is applicable to everybody. I always have to qualify things. But at the same time, he's still addressing a specific pastoral problem with a specific group of people. So he says, look, so let's remember, he's speaking to this Jewish audience, and he says, the one who is righteous will live by faith. Okay? And that's Abraham, who was not a Jew. He was a Gentile, okay, before God grabbed him. And so then Paul says, okay, well, so let's think about what we think about Gentiles. In fact, this is what he's doing. He says, let's think about how you're prejudiced. What do you think about when you think about a Gentile? Okay, Paul gets at the heart of it. And he says, this is it. He says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness, and those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible, has been understood through the things they made. So they are without excuse, okay? And you can kind of see this is what the Jewish are like, yeah, they all should know this. They should be able to see God, but they don't. Only we can see. So you can kind of see them being like, yes, that's exactly right. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, etc. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images, for idolatry, resembling a mortal human being or birds or four-footed animals or reptiles. Although this kind of should have caught at the Jewish people a little bit because they did this too. Remember that golden calf. Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their heart to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped the creature rather than the creator. And then he goes into a whole litany of really bad sins. Okay, really bad sins. And he goes on and he says, and then they still refused to recognize God, so God gave them over to their wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, everything, okay, blah. And he says, they know God's decree that those who do such things deserve to die, yet they not only do them, but applaud others who practice them. Complete debauchery, okay, is really the picture that we get here. Well, where is this from? Pulled out Scott McKnight's book here, okay, and I'm going to read from it. What we know is that this passage, 18 through 32, is extremely similar to a 1st century BC. So Paul's writing in the 1st century AD, the 1st century after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So a whole century before that, a book was written called The Wisdom of Solomon. It was a Jewish book written to a Jewish audience. It was written to the Hellenized Jews who had been living in the Greek and Roman world for so long that they were beginning to forget what it meant to be Jewish. And they were starting to act like the Greco-Roman world around them. And the Wisdom of Solomon is written to them, it's reminding them of who they are and who this pagan world is around them. So let me just read you a little bit of it, okay? So this is it. For one of the things, Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 14, it says, for the worship of idols not to be named is the beginning and cause and end of every evil. But just penalties will overtake them on 2 counts, because they thought wrongly about God in devoting themselves to idols, and because in deceit they swore unrighteously through contempt for holiness. Okay, so sort of the same idea that we see with very similar language about this pagan world who trades the truth of God for idols made by human hands. And then it goes on, it says, for all people who were ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable from the good things that are seen to know the one who exists, nor did they recognize the artisan while paying heed to his works. Again, very similar to what we see in Romans chapter 1. But they supposed that either fire or wind or swift air or the circle of the stars or turbulent water or luminaries of heaven were the gods that rule the world. So they looked around them at nature, and instead of realizing it was God, they attributed it to lesser deities. And so they didn't recognize the true God. Then it goes on, it says, then it was not enough for them to err about the knowledge of God, but though living in great strife due to ignorance, they call such great evils peace. For whether they kill children in their initiations, or celebrate secret mysteries, or hold frenzied revels with strange customs, they no longer keep either their lives or their marriage pure, but they act treacherously. They kill each other. They are adulterous. They rage in riots of blood and murder, theft, deceit, corruption, faithfulness, tumult, perjury, confusion over what is good, forgetfulness of favors, defiling of souls, sexual perversion, disorder in marriage, adultery, and debauchery. And it continues on. This idea that this is this Hellenized pagan world. And the idea is like, why are you living like this? This is what pagans do. This is exactly what Paul does. He says, look, this is what we think about about the Roman world. You know, when you look at those Gentiles, this is what you see. Okay? But then he looks at him and he says, but guess what? You are just like them. And in verse 2, he points out what, it says the righteous judgment of God. He points out, he says, look, you are judging these people. But let me tell you that you are no different from them. And this must have really hit the Jewish audience because they're like, whoa, we don't do those things. And actually, Paul's going to look at them and say, you do them. So let's see this. I'm already short on time. I told you there was a lot here. He says, look, therefore you have no excuse, whoever you are, when you judge others, for in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself. And in fact, remember their question that we're going to see in chapter 3 is, does it matter? What good is it to be a Jew? And what Paul actually says in chapter 2 says, it's a little worse to be a Jew because you knew better. It's like Gentiles, they may not know better, but you knew better and you still did these things. So he says, you condemn yourself because you are the judge and you are doing the very same things. And he said, you say, we know God's judgment on those who do such things in accordance with truth. And he says, Paul says, do you imagine, whoever you are, that when you judge those who do such things, yet do them yourself, you will escape the judgment of God? He says, just because you're a Jew, do you think that you're going to escape God's judgment because you act the way you perceive these pagan Gentiles? Essentially he's saying, are you any better? Do you really think you're better than them? And Paul is getting at the heart of prejudice here. He says, do you think you're any better than them? And he says, or do you despise the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience? Do you not realize that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? I mean, ouch. He says, you should look at this and it should bring you to your knees. And instead, you're sitting there saying, oh, I'm not as bad as them. I'm better than them. I mean, essentially, Paul's like, oh, you are in more peril than you thought you were. And he says, but by your hard and impenitent heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath when God's righteous judgment will be repealed. Okay? And this is pretty harsh. Where he's like, look, you thought these are what the Gentiles are doing, or this is the way you think the Gentiles are acting, but you are no better. You are somebody who knows the law, and you should act better, but you don't. Okay? And he goes on, and he says, and if you see that middle passage between chapter 6, verses 6 through 16, okay? And Paul he's like, okay, so y'all sin badly, and Gentiles sin badly. Right. Well, that's why God came. That's essentially what he says. He says, you are no better than them. You both need God. Okay? And he says, there will be anguish and distress, I'm picking up in verse 9, for everyone who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek. He says there will be anguish and distress for you for sinning, as well as for the Gentiles for sinning. But then in verse 10, he says, but glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek, for God shows no partiality. He says there's a way out. There is a way out of this for you and also for the Greek. There is no difference. Okay, so he's saying there is no difference. Who are you to think you are so much better? And then in verse 12, that verse we know so well, that now we see that Paul is directing it specifically to a group of Jewish believers who are viewing themselves as better than the Gentile believers. And Paul says, no. He says, all have sinned apart from the law, and all will perish apart from the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law who will be justified. And as a medieval historian, I have to tell you that verse, this idea of being doers of the law, was a very common theme in medieval sermons. And in fact, whenever I hear that verse, I actually think about the passage in Luke 11, where Jesus is walking through the crowd and a woman calls out to him and says, blessed is your mother who gave you birth. And Jesus turns around and looks at her and says, no, blessed are those who hear me and do what I say. And so this is straight out of the mouth of Jesus. And this woman was saying, blessed is the person who gave birth to you. The Jewish woman, the Jewish country who gave birth to you. And Jesus turns and looks at her and says, no, blessed are those who hear and do the word of God. Okay? So again, this idea that, yes, there is this Jewish nation that brought you here, but Jesus is for everyone. And the Jews are no better than the Gentiles. Okay? Now, he's going to turn to the Gentiles in just a couple of chapters. So just, hang in there. This is not all just, and he's not upset with all Jews. He's upset with Jews, with Jewish believers who are being judgmental towards Gentile believers. That's who he's addressing. He's not saying all Jewish people are doing this. He's saying there are a group of Jewish people who are doing this. And in fact, remember, this was the whole thing about the council, that early council that we find in Acts. This is the council in which, they had, where Paul comes before them and he says, look, Gentiles do not have to obey the law to be Christian. And that was actually decided at the council that is true. So these Judaizers, Paul is still working against these. He's like, this is who he's speaking to, the Judaizers, Jewish believers who are trying to make Gentiles follow the law. Okay? And so he says, look, when Gentiles who do not possess, and then he goes on, he says, for it is the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law who will be justified. When Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, and you can hear them, these Judaizers who are saying, oh yeah, but you got to do this too. I'm going to look down upon you. You're not going to be able to be fully part of the membership of the body, whatever, because you are a second-class citizen. You are a Gentile believer, and you are not fully Jew. And Paul looks at them and he says, no. He says, guess what? Gentiles, even though they don't know the law, they sometimes obey the heart of the law better than you do. Okay? He says, and how do you explain that? You explain that because they know God. Okay? It's not the law, it's the relationship with God. And so he says that having the law, Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires. And then it goes verse 15, it says, they show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts will accuse or perhaps excuse them on that day when, according to the gospel, God will judge the secret thoughts of all. Okay? So this is a little scary here in Romans, but he's also directing, he's like, look, the purpose is not what you do or look like on the outside. The purpose is what you believe on the inside. And he said, that's it. And you've just got to stop judging these Gentile believers because they are not Jewish. Okay, he's coming down really hard. And in fact, in verse 17, then he turns back to these Judaizers, let's call them that for simplification here. He says, but if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast of your relation to God and know his will and determine what is best because you are instructed in the law, okay, this is really, he's like, so you do all these things, you do everything that you think is right? You are the Pharisee, okay? You do all this stuff right. And he says, and if you are sure that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness. I mean, this is what he's saying. He says, who are you, these Judaizer Christians, who are saying that you can guide these Gentile Christians because you are a Jew and you are better? He says, you think you're a light to the darkness? Which, of course, that was a term that was used for Jesus. He's like, you are acting like Jesus, and he's really coming down hard on them. He says, you think this, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of children, having the law, the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then that teach others, will you not teach yourself? And this is also sort of the plank in the eye, where Jesus says, before, if you are trying to get the speck out of your brother's or sister's eye, you need to get the plank out of your own first. I mean, the gospel is consistent in its message. And so Paul looks at him and he says, who are you? He says, will you teach others? Will you preach against stealing and then steal yourself? While you preach, you that forbid adultery, do you commit adultery? You that abhor idols, do you rob temples? You that boast in the law, do you dishonor God? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Okay. So again, he says, being a Jew is of no value if you aren't acting, if you are not believing in God and acting in the gospel of Jesus, if you are not acting in Christoformity, if you are not striving to be more like Jesus, none of this other stuff matters. If you may say, well, I'm Jewish and I follow this things and I this, and he said, no, but you're also doing these other things. You are just like the Gentiles. The only salvation for all of us is Jesus. Okay? And he continues on in that. He says, look, And down at the end of it, he says, circumcision is of no value if your inner heart is not circumcised. And moving on to verse 29, he says, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and real circumcision is a matter of the heart. It is spiritual, not literal. Such a person receives praise, not from others, but from God. Once again, this is clear language that shows us he is talking to Jewish believers because they are the ones who would have recognized the significance of this circumcision language. Gentile believers, this is still like, what were you doing to your bodies? This is completely foreign to them. They would have not understood any of this. He's not speaking to them. He's speaking to the Jewish believers who are condemning the Gentile believers because they are not following the law. And he looks at them and he says, it's not about the law. It's about your heart. It's about, are you following in the footsteps of Jesus? Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Everything got quiet. I didn't get any comments for a while. I know that was really a lot and heavy there. Is there now? I think the way we are going through this, it isn't really changing a lot about the theology that we see in Romans. It's just contextualizing it and helping, and hopefully by contextualizing it, making it more understandable what Paul is doing and what he is trying to do. But at any time, if you have any questions or if you have any comments, then let me know. I know Romans does get very heavy. And so that's one of the reasons why, some of the jokes we said at the beginning is that, lots of people just don't make it through Romans because it is so heavy. But if we think about what Paul is doing, is that he is addressing this specific problem where he has these disunity in one of these most important churches in these house churches in Rome, important place in the Roman Empire, and they're having this disunity because the weak, these Jewish believers who are acting judgmentally towards the strong, the Gentile believers who are wealthier, have more power, more social clout, but also are totally frustrated with these Jewish believers who keep trying to make them do more things. Okay, and so we have this tension, pretty severe tension, and this is what Paul is addressing. Okay, so I'll stop there. I'll wait and see if there's any other questions. Next week we will pull this into chapter 3 and 4, which will get into a conversation of Abraham and faith. You might want to think about maybe some election questions that we might talk a little bit, because it starts getting into the purpose of the law, and then again we're going to see the Abraham story is going to come up over and over again. So anyway, so if you have any questions about that, if things you want me to talk about, then you can send those to me. And then we're going to move into chapters 5 through 8, in which Paul then turns to the other side. Division and strife is never just one-sided. There's always another part to it. And so Paul turns to the other part, and that is these Gentile believers who are frustrated with the weak, with these Jewish believers. Okay? So I will go ahead and end it for now. I don't see any questions coming up, so thank you for staying with me, and I will get this downloaded, and I will see y'all next week. It was good to see you this morning, Belinda. So hopefully we can have an end to COVID before too long. Okay, see y'all later.